So before we actually start to talk about the different techniques used to manage a forest, it's important to understand why someone would want to actually manage the forest in the first place. So the yellow box at the top here describes why someone could manage a forest. Now, it's really all about the exploitation of a forest's resources. So you might want to exploit a forest for wood, for timber, etc., but without causing any damage to existing plant and animal species. So it has to be sustainable. If it was uncontrolled exploitation of a forest, well, that would actually cause irreversible damage to the forest. So imagine the trees were cut down through deforestation. Well, obviously there's a lack of trees to photosynthesize, and that could result in less CO2 being absorbed, which we know increases the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, which might contribute to climate change. We know deforestation can result in a loss of biodiversity because of a loss of different habitats. It can also result in both soil erosion and flooding in low-level areas. So if you have a look at the deforestation video, we can see some of the consequences of that on the environment. Now, sustainable management of a forest will meet the needs of the local human population. So, for example, supplying timber and wood, but without compromising the needs of the future generations, because the forest has been managed and sustained, so there's no permanent damage to the forest. So some of the techniques we're going to employ to manage the forest then. One traditional technique, certainly in the UK, is called coppicing, and that's where a tree is actually cut down, but instead of removing the whole tree, it's cut down to near the earth's surface. So that leaves what's called a stool, and that's a few centimeters normally above the ground level. Now from that stool emerge vertical stems called poles, and they will grow to different heights before they're again chopped down. So it helps to keep the root systems in the soil, and they obviously absorb water, etc., and that prevents flooding. Coppicing does actually improve biodiversity, and we'll see why shortly. Now, the second technique to help manage a forest is called selective cutting. So some of the larger trees might be felled, that means cut down, whilst other trees are left in place. So for example, the trees on a sloped area of the forest might be maintained and not cut down, and that might prevent flooding in the low-level areas or the low-lying areas at the bottom of the slope. Another type of technique is called long rotation times, and this is where trees are allowed to grow for longer periods of time before being cut down. So that's going to provide a more stable ecosystem, more stable different habitats for a longer period of time. Now, forest management is, as we've just mentioned, the sustainable replanting and regeneration of forests. So with careful management, it is possible to remove timber without having this irreversible destroying damage to the ecosystem of the forest. And that's obviously especially true if only a small number of trees are actually removed each year. So coppicing is the first method we're going to talk about. And if we look at the pictures, what we do is we cut down these trees near to the surface of the earth, and that leaves what's called a stump or a stool in the earth. So we don't completely remove the whole of the tree. Now we know these trees, when they're fairly well developed, they'll have quite an extensive root system down into the soil. So this method of coppicing actually maintains the root structure in the soil because it doesn't remove the whole plant. Now what happens from that stool is we get these vertical stems that grow from the stump or the stool. Now it depends on the type of species, but these poles can grow particularly high, and as they do develop, as we can see here on the right hand side, they provide habitats for different organisms like birds. They might provide nesting sites for different species of bird, so that can also help to increase biodiversity. Now this is quite a nice example. So different species of trees can be coppiced, and we can see here this type of tree has actually been cut down to the stool, and that's been left in the ground. So these trees here have a very, very extensive root system. So that's not been removed. One benefit of that is that water can be absorbed from the soil after rainfall. So it's unlikely that this soil becomes waterlogged. Another benefit is that as these vertical poles develop, they're kind of vertical stems from the stool that's left in the ground, it allows light to penetrate through down onto the surface here. So quite often, as these poles develop, more light gets to the surface of the earth, so we get an increase in biodiversity there, where we've got small shrubs like bracken, for example, and other small plants start to develop. Now when you've got smaller plants that start to develop, we also get increased biodiversity because we get more insects in the area and other invertebrates as well. So this can actually result in an increased biodiversity. Now we know these vertical poles or vertical stems can be breeding sites, they can be nesting sites for birds, etc. So they again increase biodiversity. Now after a certain number of years, what can happen is these poles are actually removed once again, and that might be used for timber, depending on the species of the tree, or firewood, etc. Now this is quite sustainable because if you've got a large forest area such as this on the bottom left, it's normally divided into segments like this. So one segment of the forest might be coppiced at a certain time point, and then a little bit later, again depending on the species, the next segment might be coppiced. So by the time the second segment in red has been coppiced, the first segment, well, the poles have already started to regrow. So if this is the stool in the ground here, the vertical stems have already started to regrow, and that would be in segment number 1. So by the time all of the areas have been coppiced, we've got a collection of different heights of poles. So that's going to be, or it's going to allow different species of birds to nest within these. So again, it does help to increase biodiversity. Okay, the second idea is called selective cutting, and this is where some of the larger trees are cut down or felled whilst maintaining or leaving other trees in their original place. So why would this be very useful on steep slopes and near rivers? Well, if we have a look at the two pictures at the bottom, if you completely cut away all the trees, so if you completely deforest an area, well, when there's heavy rainfall on the upper surface, that's actually going to wash away a lot of the topsoil. So a lot of this topsoil gets washed away and the water kind of drains down to the lowland areas. So this increases waterlogging in the lowland areas, which we know decreases soil fertility, because, for example, we get a lack of oxygen if you've got waterlogged soil. We get bacteria such as Pseudomonas, which is an obligate anaerobe, that absorbs nitrate ions and converts them to nitrogen gas. So if you've got less nitrate ions in the soil becomes less fertile. Now, not only does the lowland area, so we can say low-lying or lowland area, become waterlogged, but the upper area of the slope has had the topsoil removed. So topsoil removed. Now the topsoil is particularly rich in minerals such as nitrates, phosphates, etc. So if that topsoil gets kind of washed away, then the area becomes again less fertile because of the lack or the lower concentration of minerals in the soil. So one possible procedure to use is where the trees are actually maintained on the top or the middle portion of a slope. So because these trees have got an extensive root system that goes quite deep into the soil, it's going to prevent water being washed away down to the lowland area. So low-lying area. So the extensive root system helps to maintain the integrity of the soil and absorb a lot of the water after rainfall, and it also prevents soil erosion as well. So on steep slopes, the total removal of trees would leave the soil vulnerable to soil erosion. Selective cutting helps to maintain the nutrients in the forest soil, and it minimizes the amount of soil which is washed away into rivers and other waterways. Now, the third type of management policy is called long rotation times. So this is where trees are allowed to grow for a longer period of time before they actually get cut down. So we know that's going to increase habitat diversity, and if you've got more diverse habitats, then obviously that's also going to increase biodiversity, and that allows a more stable and long-term establishment of different habitats, so it allows the biodiversity to be maintained for a longer period of time. Now, other ideas as well as long rotation times involve planting trees optimum distances apart. So imagine you planted trees very, very close together. Well, that would increase the level of intra-specific competition. So the root systems of these trees would compete for the same minerals like nitrates and phosphates and magnesium. And what you'd get is very tall, elongated trees. But obviously that's not what we really want. We want trees to grow optimally. So if you plant trees far enough apart, it reduces intraspecific competition. So it reduces that competition and allows more optimum plant growth. Now, something else that you have to take into account is obviously the control of pests and disease. So we know trees grow well and produce very high quality timber, okay, if there's a lack of pests and disease. So if you can actually control pests either through use of herbicides or biological control, possibly where you introduce an organism that can actually feed off the pest organism, so you would actually decrease the number of pest organisms by having a natural predator introduced. That's going to mean obviously fewer trees need to be felled or cut down, and best use is made of the land. So we limit the number of pests for these particular variety or species of trees. We limit diseases in the trees. That allows them to grow more productively, so we get higher quality trees, higher quality timber. We don't have to cut down quite as many trees. So this is quite a nice example of an exam question with a little bit of maths involved as well. So the question says, top left, one of the most valuable crops planted by the Forestry Commission is called spruce. And this is because spruce trees have a very high yield of very high quality timber. Now, early trial plantings showed that spruce trees grew actually quite slowly when planted on the same land as heather. And then it says, name the type of competition shown between spruce and heather. Well, because these are different species of plants and they compete for similar minerals such as nitrates, phosphates, magnesium ions, we know it's going to be called interspecific competition. So inter means within. So interspecific is competition between members of different species, interspecific. Now, just quickly going to talk a little bit about spruce and heather. So the North Yorkshire moors, you get lots and lots of heather growing over the surface of this area. Now, if that was just left to its own devices, this would actually, over time, the heather would grow quite extensively, and then it would just start to kind of die off a little bit, and it would start to be outcompeted or succeeded by a succession by other plants and sort of taller shrubs and taller trees. However, there's lots and lots of heather on the moors because it's managed very carefully. And what these people do, they actually burn the heather. Now that does burn all the old growth, and it burns the heather plants right down to the surface of the earth, but it doesn't destroy the root systems, and the heather can then just start to grow once again. So when the heather grows, the young shoots start to emerge once again. And that's very, very good for things like animals that live off the heather, like grouse, which obviously in some areas is actually hunted. Now, spruce is slightly different then. So these are these taller trees. Now, as we just said, very, very high quality timber from the spruce trees. So when they're grown together, these spruce trees actually don't quite grow as tall because of this interspecific competition. So the next question, part C here, I'm just going to jump to part C. Further trial plantings on land dominated by heather showed that the growth of spruce trees was greatly assisted by planting another tree, and that was called Japanese larch. So that's the biggest growth here. Young spruce trees were 50 centimeters high when first planted. So we're going to write this here. So 50 centimeters high is the same as saying 0.5 meters. And these are the spruce trees when first planted. Okay. Calculate the difference in the rate of growth when these trees were grown with Japanese larch compared to the control. So the ones we're going to compare, the spruce and the heather grown together, this is effectively the control. The spruce and heather together with Japanese larch is the height we're going to look at as well. So we're going to start to compare these two values. So it says calculate the difference in the rate of growth. So the rate of growth. So let's start to calculate the rate of growth. Now for the control, we can see after 15 years, the spruce has actually grown to 2 meters high. And that's in 15 years. So we know the spruce started out at 0.5 meters. So actually the spruce has grown 1.5 meters in 15 years. Now if we divide 1.5 by 15, we get the growth per year. So that will come out as 0.1 meters in growth per year. So 1.5 meters in 15 years. So 1.5 divided by 15 is 0.1 meters per year. Now, when we look at the spruce growth here, in the presence of both heather and Japanese larch, we get 4.5 meters after 15 years. So 4.5 meters high, this spruce this time, in 15 years. So that's an increase of 4 meters of growth in 15 years. So 4 meters divided by 15 years is 0.27 meters per year of growth. So we've gone from the control was 0.1 meter per year to 0.27 meters per year. So the difference then here is 0.27 minus 0.1 meters per year, and that gives us 0.17 meters per year difference in growth. So this here is the difference in growth because of the presence of Japanese larch. Then it says, suggest one way in which a nurse crop may aid the growth of the spruce trees. So this Japanese larch here is actually considered what we call a nurse crop. So let's look at this carefully. So we get higher growth with the Japanese larch. So that might, it says suggest, so it might actually produce something beneficial to the spruce tree to allow its growth. So imagine this, it might be something like nitrogen fixation, so it might increase the ammonium content of the soil. It might make certain chemicals that would induce or increase the growth of the spruce tree. One other suggestion we could say is that the larch, different to sort of increasing the growth of the spruce tree, it might somehow inhibit the growth of the heather. So it says in the question that heather actually has a negative impact on spruce growth. So we could say the Japanese larch makes some sort of inhibitors that prevent further growth of the heather, which allows more spruce to grow to a higher level. So suggest one way in which a nurse crop may aid the growth of spruce trees. Well, we're going to say the nurse crop may fix nitrogen increasing the ammonium content of the soil, which we know would increase the growth of the spruce tree. We could also say it may, so this is the nurse crop, may also produce other molecules stimulating spruce growth, or molecules that inhibit heather growth. And that'll get us 2 marks.